The action invoker is used by a controller to locate and execute an action method. This method will generate a response for the request. In a lot of ways, the action invoker is what really empowers the execute method of the controller. By delegating the work of handling a request to various action methods, the framework allows us to handle different requests in different ways. The action invoker follows the same pattern as a lot of other MVC components. It's implemented through a fairly simple interface with only one method that's called invoke action. Using this interface, you could create your own version of an action invoker that handles requests in its own way. In my experience, creating a custom action invoker is actually a pretty rare occurrence. MVC already provides a very powerful default implementation for us, and that's called controller action invoker. We can also use other simpler extension points to alter the default invoker's behavior and the action method execution process. For example, we can use the action selector attributes to impact which method is chosen. We'll look more at that in a later lesson. For right now, rather than build our own implementation of the action invoker, I want to really explore this default controller action invoker. Let's return to the MVC source code to look more closely at the action invoker execution sequence that I described earlier. I have opened the MVC controller class, which is the class you'll usually inherit from when creating your own controllers. We are most interested in this execute core method. Now you might be asking yourself, what's the difference between execute and execute core? Well, if I jump over to another tab, I have this class called controller base open. The main controller actually inherits from this class. Controller base is the class that implements iController in the execute method. Execute core is an abstract method that's called inside of execute, which we can override to provide our own functionality. So back inside the main controller class, let's just observe how little code there actually is in this execute core method. There are really only two lines that we're concerned with. First, we're retrieving the action name from our route data, which remember is populated based on the route that was matched. Next, we're simply passing that action name and a context object into the invoke action method that we saw in the slides. This should help to illustrate how much the action invoker actually handles for us in the scope of the controller's execution. I have the action invoker open in a third tab, and for now we're really only concerned with that invoke action method. The action invoker actually has a lot of complex logic inside of it. The goal here is not to bore you with an extensive walkthrough of all this code, so for right now we're just going to discuss this at a high level. What's really interesting about this method is that you can actually see the sequence we looked at in the slides surprisingly clearly. Early in the method, the invoker calls a method called findAction, which will get a list of candidate action methods and select the best one for this request. A bit further down, we can see where our authentication takes place using filters. Right below that is the authorization step that we discussed. Assuming both of these steps succeed, we proceed on into the next block, where we find the important invoke action method with filters method. I'll let you explore this method on your own, but inside of it you can discover how our onActionExecuted and onActionExecuting filters are called. This method returns a post-action context, which is basically the action result that's returned by our action methods. If we move down a bit further, you can see where that's executed. From that point on, we move into result execution, which is a discussion for the next module. I really encourage you to at least skim through this class a bit more. It can provide some great insight into action method execution. This brief tour should just give you a high-level understanding of the main responsibilities of this class. We now want to look at these steps in more depth, starting with action method selection.